The funeral director looked me dead in the eye and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that grieving families never check the numbers. He had no idea I had been recording him for the last 40 minutes. My mother died on a Tuesday. She died the way she had lived, without drama, without fuss, in her own bed, with the curtains open so she could see the garden one last time. She was 68 years old. She had worked as a seamstress for 32 years, saved carefully, never asked anyone for anything she did not need, and left behind 2 adult children, a small apartment full of fabric and thread, and a funeral insurance policy she had paid into every single month for 22 years because she did not want to be a burden. She had told me this herself, more than once. She would sit at her sewing table, pinning a hem or adjusting a collar, and she would say, without looking up, that she had taken care of everything, that we would not have to worry, that the policy covered it. I held on to that. In the first hours after she died, when the apartment was too quiet, and her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, and her tea had gone cold in the kitchen, I held on to the idea that she had prepared this for us, that there was a plan, that all I had to do was follow it. That was my first mistake. Not the only one, but the first. My sister Vera lives 3 hours away. She drove through the night and arrived at 6 in the morning, red-eyed, still in the clothes she had thrown on in the dark. We sat together in the kitchen and did not say much. We drank the cold tea because neither of us thought to make fresh. The reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Neither of us moved them. We called the funeral home that the insurance policy named. It was a company called Pitch & Sons, which had apparently been operating in our city for over 40 years. The woman on the phone was warm and professional. She said they would handle everything. She said someone would come to the apartment that afternoon to begin the arrangements. The someone was a man named Mr. Dalman. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a dark suit that was just slightly too well fitted for a man who worked with grief for a living. His shoes were polished, his hair was combed with precision. He carried a leather folder and he shook my hand with both of his, the kind of handshake designed to feel like a hug without the physical contact. He said he was so sorry. He said my mother had clearly been a wonderful woman. He had never met her. He looked around the apartment and said it was clear she had been a person of taste and warmth. I noticed that he was already making small assessments as he looked around, the way a real estate agent does when they walk into a house they are about to price. I told myself I was being uncharitable. The man had a difficult job. He dealt with grief every day. Of course, he had developed a certain professional smoothness. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his folder. Here is something they do not tell you about arranging a funeral. The decisions come at you very fast, in a specific order, and each one is framed as a natural next step. You are not given time to think. You are not given a moment to breathe. The folder opens, the options appear, and the man across from you has a calm, practiced tone that makes every choice feel urgent and every hesitation feel like a failure of love. Mr. Dalman started with the coffin. He had a printed catalogue, laminated pages, photographs of wooden caskets in warm lighting. He pointed to one near the middle of the range and said it was what most families chose for a woman of her age and dignity. It was priced at €2,400. I noted the price. I did not say anything. Then came the flowers. Then the printed memorial cards. Then the announcement in the local newspaper. Then the transport from the apartment to the chapel. Then the refrigeration fee, which he mentioned almost in passing, as though it were a parking charge. Then the chapel rental. Then the celebrant fee. Then the music license. Then the cleaning of the chapel after the service. Then the grave preparation. Then the grave marker, temporary and permanent. Then the coordination with the cemetery administration. Then something he called the family accompaniment service, which appeared to mean that someone from Peach and Sons would stand near us during the burial and be available if we needed anything. Each item appeared on a printed sheet. The sheet was not a quote. It was not a contract. It was a worksheet, he called it, a way of getting a sense of what the family wanted. He wrote the numbers in pencil, which I noticed. Pencil. At the end of the first meeting, the worksheet showed a total of just under €9,000. The funeral insurance policy my mother had paid into for 22 years covered $4,000. Mr. Dalman expressed a gentle sympathy about the gap. He said this was, unfortunately, quite common. Costs had risen. The policy was older. He said P.H. & Sons offered a very reasonable payment arrangement, and that many families found it helpful to simply settle the difference after the service, when things had calmed down. He left the worksheet behind. He said to take our time, but that they would need to confirm arrangements within 24 hours because of the scheduling at the chapel. After he left, Vera and I sat at the kitchen table again. She looked at the worksheet. She said 9,000 euros was more than she had expected. I said yes. She said maybe we should trust him, that he knew what things cost. I said yes, maybe. But I did not feel yes. I felt something I can only describe as a low hum of wrongness. Not loud, not dramatic, just a frequency that does not match the room. I had brought my phone to the table during the meeting. I had set it face down next to the sugar bowl. I had opened the voice recorder before Mr. Dalman arrived, because I had read once, years ago, that it was legal to record conversations you are a party to in our state. And I had thought, in a vague and not yet specific way, that it might be useful to have a record of what was discussed. I had not told Vera. I had not told Mr. Dalman. The recording was 1 hour and 7 minutes long. That evening, while Vera slept on the couch, I sat at my mother's sewing table with my laptop and began to do what my mother had always done when she was given a price she was not sure about. I looked it up. I found the official price list for Peach & Sons on their website. In Germany, funeral homes are required to publish their prices. Most people do not know this. Most people, as Mr. Dalman had apparently calculated, do not check. I went through the worksheet item by item. The coffin Mr. Dalman had recommended, the one he said most families chose, was listed on the Petch website at 1,900 euros. He had written 2,400 on the worksheet. The chapel rental was listed at 220 euros for a standard service. He had written 340. The printed memorial cards, the website listed them at 80 euros for 50 cards. He had written 160. The quantity he had written was also 50. The transport from the apartment to the chapel, listed at 140 euros. He had written 210. The refrigeration fee appeared twice on the worksheet. 2 separate line items, 2 separate charges, both for the same service. I sat very still at my mother's sewing table for a long time. Her thimble was on the table. A small silver thimble she had used for as long as I could remember, worn smooth on the inside where her finger had pressed it thousands of times. I picked it up and held it. I did not cry. I was past crying for the moment. I was in a different place, a colder and quieter place, and I was thinking very clearly. I spent the next 2 hours requesting quotes from 3 other funeral homes in the city. 2 of them had online quote forms. One I called directly. I explained that I was arranging a funeral for my mother, that she had a partial insurance policy, and that I needed a full written quote for a dignified but straightforward service. I gave them the same basic parameters I had given Mr. Dalman. The quotes came back the next morning. They ranged from 5,200 to 6,100 euros. All 3 included everything Mr. Dalman had listed, and 2 of them included things he had charged for separately as standard inclusions. I also called the funeral insurance company directly. I asked them to send me the full policy documentation, which they emailed within the hour. I read it carefully. The policy did not cover 4,000 euros. It covered 4,800 euros. Mr. Dalman had told us 4,000. I made a list. I printed the comparison quotes. I printed the PH price list from their website. I printed the insurance policy email. I labelled each document. I put them in a folder. My mother had kept a small wooden box in the top drawer of her sewing cabinet. It held her most important papers, her identity documents, the insurance policy, a handwritten list of who should be notified when she died. I put my folder in the box next to her papers, and I called Mr. Dalman and told him we would like to meet again. He arrived the next afternoon with the same suit, the same folder, and the same 2-handed handshake. He sat at the kitchen table. He asked if we had had time to think things over. He said he understood it was a difficult time. I told him yes, we had some questions about the worksheet. I watched something very small change in his face. Not much, just a slight adjustment, the way a poker player's expression shifts when the cards are not what they expected. He said of course he was happy to go through everything. I asked about the coffin price. I said I'd seen a different number on their website. He said prices varied depending on configuration, on lining, on handles. I asked him to show me in the catalogue where the configuration he had quoted was listed. He turned pages for a moment. He said the catalogue was not always fully up to date. I asked about the chapel rental. He said the price could vary by day and time. I asked which day and time he had quoted for. He looked at the worksheet. He said Saturday morning. I showed him the price list from his own website, which listed Saturday morning chapel rental at 220 euros. He had written 340. He said there were additional setup costs. I asked where those were itemised. He said they were sometimes included in the chapel fee and sometimes listed separately. I said I noticed they were not separately listed on the worksheet either. There was a silence. I asked about the refrigeration fee appearing twice. I said I was not sure I understood why the same service appeared as two separate charges. He looked at the worksheet for a long time. He said it was possible there had been a data entry error. He said he would look into it. I said I would appreciate that. I did not raise my voice once. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply asked questions and waited for answers. And each time the answer was incomplete, I waited a little longer. He began to move through the meeting differently. He was slower. He was less smooth. He kept touching the corner of the folder, a small, repetitive gesture, index finger tapping the leather edge. At one point, when Vera had stepped out of the kitchen for a moment, he leaned slightly forward and said, in a quieter voice, that he understood I was going through a difficult time, and that in his experience, families in grief sometimes focused on details that, in the larger picture, were not where their energy was best spent. He said the numbers on the worksheet were always open to discussion, but that what mattered most was giving my mother a beautiful farewell. And then he said it, quietly, almost gently, as though it were a piece of professional wisdom he was sharing with me, that in his experience, people in grief rarely went back through the numbers. I nodded slowly. I said, I understand. I did not tell him about the phone next to the sugar bowl. We ended the meeting without signing anything. I told him we needed one more day. He said, of course. He completely understood, and he shook my hand again with both of his, and he left. Vera came back into the kitchen. She asked how it had gone. I told her I thought we should find a different funeral home. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the folder on the table, and she said, okay. We arranged my mother's funeral through a different company. The service was dignified. The coffin was simple and beautiful. There were flowers from my mother's garden, cut by Vera the morning of the burial, because the other funeral home said that was perfectly fine. The total cost was €5,600, which the insurance covered with €200 to spare. My mother was buried on a Friday morning. It rained, which she would have found appropriate. She always said rain at a funeral was honest weather. I stood at the grave and held her thimble in my pocket. I had not forgotten about Mr. Dalman. I want to be clear about something. What happened next was not about revenge. Or rather, it was not only about revenge. It was about the fact that Mr. Dalman had done this before. He had done it many times before. He had sat at many kitchen tables across from many families with cold tea and reading glasses on the nightstand and an open folder, and he had written numbers in pencil on worksheets, and he had said, quietly, that people in grief do not check. I checked. I filed a formal complaint with the Bestattungsgewerbe-Innung, the trade association for funeral directors in our region. I had researched the process carefully. I knew that member firms were bound by a code of conduct that included transparent pricing, accurate written quotes, and fair dealing with clients. I knew that the Innung had a complaints committee. I knew that findings could affect a firm's membership status, and that membership status affected access to certain cemetery contracts and municipal referral agreements. In other words, Mr. Dalman and Peach and Sons had something real to lose. The complaint hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after my mother's burial. It was held in a conference room at the Innung's offices, a room with beige carpet and a long table and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. There were 4 people on the committee. There was a woman from the Verbraucherzentrale, the Consumer Advice Centre, who had been invited as an observer. Mr. Dalman arrived with a man I assumed was a lawyer or a business partner. He was wearing the same suit. He looked at me across the table and gave a brief professional nod, the kind that means nothing. I had prepared a binder. I had organised it into sections with labelled dividers. Section 1, the original worksheet from Peach and Sons, with each discrepancy highlighted and cross-referenced to the official price list, which was in Section 2. Section 3, the 3 comparison quotes from other funeral homes, each dated and on official letterhead. Section 4, the insurance policy documentation showing the actual coverage amount versus the amount Mr. Dalman had cited. Section 5, a written transcript of the audio recording with the relevant passages highlighted and time-stamped. Section 6 was a USB drive taped to the inside back cover. It contained the full audio file. I gave a copy of the binder to each committee member. I gave a copy to the observer from the Verbraucherzentrale. I placed one copy in front of Mr. Dalman and his associate. I watched Mr. Dalman open the binder. I watched him turn to Section 5. I watched him read the transcript. I watched the colour change in his face. He looked up at me, then he looked down again. The committee chair asked me to walk them through the complaint. I did. I was precise. I was calm. I did not editorialize. I presented the discrepancies, the documentation, and the timeline. I noted the double billing. I noted the misrepresentation of the insurance coverage. I noted the statement about grieving families not checking the numbers, and I noted the timestamp on the recording where it could be heard. The committee chair asked if the committee could hear the relevant portion of the recording. I said, of course. I had the timestamp ready. I played it through my laptop, which I had brought and connected to a small speaker. The room was very quiet. Mr. Dalman's voice came through clearly. The words were exactly as I had transcribed them. Mr. Dalman said the recording was taken out of context. The committee chair asked him to explain the context. He said it had been a general observation about the emotional state of bereaved families, not a statement about his own practices. The committee chair asked him to address the pricing discrepancies. He said prices could vary based on specific service configurations. The committee chair asked him to identify, for each discrepancy, the specific configuration that accounted for the difference. He could not. His associate leaned over and whispered something. Mr. Dalman straightened slightly and said that some of the worksheet figures may have reflected preliminary estimates that were subject to revision. The committee chair noted that the worksheet had been presented to the family as the basis for a service agreement and that no revision had been offered or discussed. Mr. Dalman said there may have been a communication issue. The committee chair said yes. She agreed there appeared to have been a communication issue. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes. At the end, the committee thanked me for the thoroughness of my documentation. They told Mr. Dalman that the committee would deliberate and issue a written finding within 30 days. Mr. Dalman stood up and buttoned his jacket. He looked at me one more time. I do not know exactly what he saw in my face. I was not smiling. I was not angry. I was just looking at him the way you look at something you have finished with. He left without shaking my hand. The written finding came 28 days later. I will not reproduce it in full, but I will tell you what it said in substance. The committee found that Peach & Sons had presented pricing that was inconsistent with their published price list on multiple line items, had incorrectly represented the coverage amount of the client's insurance policy, had billed for the same service twice, and had made a statement to a bereaved client that indicated awareness that clients in grief were unlikely to scrutinize charges. The committee found these practices inconsistent with the professional standards of the Inung. The consequences were specific and real. Peach & Sons was placed on formal probation within the Inung for a period of 18 months. During that period, they were excluded from the Inung's referral network, which was the list given to hospitals, care homes, and municipal offices when families asked for recommendations. They were required to undergo a pricing audit by an independent reviewer. The finding was shared, as a matter of procedure, with the local Consumer Protection Authority. The observer from the Verbraucherzentrale had been taking notes throughout the hearing. 3 weeks later, a general advisory was published on their website about funeral pricing transparency and the right of consumers to request itemized written quotes before signing any agreement. It did not name Peach & Sons. It did not need to. I heard, through someone who knew someone in the industry, that Peach & Sons lost 3 hospital referral contracts in the months that followed. I do not know if that is true. I did not verify it. It is not what I built my piece on. What I built my piece on was something smaller and more durable. After the hearing, I went home and I sat at my mother's sewing table. The apartment was in the process of being cleared, slowly, carefully, because neither Vera nor I could rush it. The fabric was still in the cabinet drawers. The thimble was on the table where I had left it. I opened my laptop and I started to write. I wrote a guide. I called it in my head at first and then in the document itself, What My Mother Paid For So You Don't Have To. It was not an angry document. It was a practical one. It explained that funeral homes in Germany are legally required to publish their prices and that you are entitled to request a written, itemized quote before agreeing to anything. It explained the difference between a worksheet and a contract. It explained that you are allowed to compare quotes from multiple providers, even while in grief, even on a tight timeline, even when someone is telling you that time is short. It explained how to check whether your funeral insurance policy covers what you think it covers. It listed the questions to ask, in plain language, at the first meeting. I included a section on recording conversations. I noted the relevant legal framework. I said that having a record of what was discussed is not aggressive or suspicious. It is simply careful. My mother was careful. She paid into an insurance policy for 22 years because she was careful. Being careful is an act of love. I sent the guide to the Verbraucherzentrale. They responded within a week and asked if they could adapt it for their own resources. I said yes. I asked only that the adapted version remain free and publicly available. It is. I also sent it to a journalist who wrote about consumer protection for a regional newspaper. She found it interesting. She wrote a piece about funeral pricing practices that ran on a Saturday morning. It did not name Mr. Dalman or Peach and Sons. It quoted me, with my permission, as a son who had lost his mother and learned in the worst week of his life that the industry relied on grief as a business advantage. I said that my mother had spent 22 years making sure she would not be a burden. The least I could do was make sure someone else's mother was protected too. The piece ran with a photograph of an empty sewing table. That was not planned. The journalist had asked if she could take a photo to accompany the article, something that represented the story without being intrusive. I thought about it, and then I took her to the apartment and showed her the table. She took the photo. The thimble was on the table. I have kept the thimble. It is on my desk now in my own apartment, next to my keyboard. It is worn smooth on the inside where her finger pressed it for 32 years. It is the smallest possible monument to a person who did everything right, and still almost got taken advantage of by a man in a well-fitted suit who counted on the fact that she would not be there to check. She was not there, but I was. If you are listening to this and you're in the middle of arranging a funeral for someone you love, here is what I want you to know. You're allowed to slow down. You're allowed to ask for everything in writing. You are allowed to take the worksheet home and look at it under better light. You are allowed to call another funeral home and ask for a quote. You are allowed to read the insurance policy yourself, rather than accepting a summary from someone who benefits from the gap between what it says and what you believe it says. You are allowed to set your phone on the table and press record. Grief is not a vulnerability that other people are entitled to exploit. It is the most human thing there is. It deserves protection, not predation. My mother taught me to be careful with a seam, to measure twice, to check the tension before you start, to not assume the fabric will hold if you have not tested it. I measured twice. I checked. Mr. Dalman was wrong. Some of us do the math, and some of us write it all down so that the next family sitting at a kitchen table with cold tea and a leather folder across from them knows exactly what questions to ask. That is what she would have wanted. Not drama, not revenge. Just someone, somewhere, not getting taken. I think she would have approved of the thimble being in the photograph. She always said the smallest tools did the most important work. She was right about that, too.